This week on Jerusalem Dateline, U.S. President Joe Biden completes a 3-day trip to Israel and then heads to the desert kingdom of Saudi Arabia. What's behind all the pomp and circumstance? Plus, Ethiopian Jews make the prophetic trip back to the Promised Land. And the Maccabee Games, the Jewish Olympics. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. U.S. President Joe Biden came to Israel for 3 days on his Mideast trip. Here's a look at his visit and what it means for the Jewish state and the region. On day one of President Biden's trip, he declared his loyalty to Israel.
The connection between the Israeli people and the American people is bone deep. It's bone deep.
The meeting between President Biden and acting Prime Minister Yair Lapid resulted in what they call the Jerusalem Declaration, a strategic partnership between the two countries. Prime Minister Lapid believes the relationship will affect the region.
From here, from Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the State of Israel, you will travel to Saudi Arabia. Your visit to Saudi Arabia is important for Israel and for the entire region, for our security and for the future and prosperity of the Middle East.
The Jerusalem Declaration is seen as the centerpiece for Biden's visit. While it includes wording about using all elements of national power to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, some question whether the Biden administration has been confronting Iran or courting Iran.
We are 18 months into the U.S. administration, into Joe Biden's presidency. He has been engaging the Iranian regime in the Vienna talks, trying to re-enter the 2015 JCPOA Iran deal to no success. This is the common link throughout the region with the moderate states, that they are all being threatened by the Iranian regime. And the real question hanging over his head is if he's going to address this threat in a serious way.
Israel's Channel 12 asked Biden about former statements that he would not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon.
Does that also mean, sir, that you would use force against Iran? Is that what that means?
That was the last resort, yes.
CBN News contributor Ellie Koenig points out that since Biden entered the White House, Iran has only moved closer to getting a nuclear bomb.
Exactly what's taken place in these last 18 months as the U.S. has been engaging in these indirect negotiations through Russia and China, believe it or not, with the Iranian regime. The Iranians have advanced their nuclear capabilities. They've also advanced their ballistic missile testing. They are just becoming more of a threat to the region and also to the United States.
In addition to Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the other major issue. For the first time, a U.S. president visited East Jerusalem, sending a signal to Israel that part of the city could be the future capital of a Palestinian state. A location critics say undermines Israeli sovereignty.
Joe Biden has indicated, or the White House has indicated, that he will be visiting a site in Jerusalem, Israel's capital, where he will not permit Israeli officials to attend, where he will meet with the enemies of Israel, those who continue to be terrorist enemies of Israel, and not allow the Israeli officials to be there. That's actually outrageous.
ACLJ senior advisor Jeff Balaban says President Biden brings his own history to this week's visit.
As Joe Biden did when he was vice president, and as President Obama did, it treats the presence of Jews in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, as though Jews are interlopers, as though Jews are occupiers, as though Jews don't belong there. In fact, as though Jews are criminals.
After his visit to eastern Jerusalem, Biden traveled to Bethlehem, where he met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas and advocated for a two-state solution.
Two states along the 1967 lines were mutually agreed to swaps remain the best way to achieve equal measure of security, prosperity, freedom, and democracy for the Palestinians as well as Israelis.
After Israel comes perhaps the most challenging part of his Mideast trip, the president going to Saudi Arabia, a country he once called a pariah due to its human rights record and connections to the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
My position on Khashoggi has been so clear. If anyone doesn't understand it in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, then they haven't been around for a while.
Biden, though, made a point of wanting more positive relations with the country, even as he admits the U.S. left a vacuum in the region.
The reason I'm going to Saudi Arabia, though, is much broader, is to promote U.S. interest. Promote U.S. interest in a way that I think we have an opportunity to reassert what I think we've made a mistake of walking away from, our influence in the Middle East.
With the United States of America distances ourselves from other people and other countries that should be stronger friends and stronger allies, they go elsewhere. And when they go elsewhere, there aren't other good, friendly countries that are waiting with open arms. Saudi has an enormous amount of resources. They are an attractive prize on the world stage. So whether it's China or Russia or others, that's where they're going to run to. And therefore, it behooves us to hug them closely and to enhance the relationship with them, even if we've got challenges in that relationship. To distance them is only going to propel them towards our enemies and our foes.
The Israeli government approved a deal that may pave the way for relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, while Saudi Arabia also granted flyover rights to Israel. When Biden does land in Saudi Arabia, he will find a different Middle East. John Medved is the founder of Our Crowd, Israel's largest venture capital platform.
Really good news recently in this part of the world has been the Abraham Accords, which was so smartly named, because what it has resulted in is this incredible release of energy between the children of Abraham.
Medved wrote about this new Middle East on his blog on LinkedIn and says the sand curtain in the Middle East is coming down.
And when this sand curtain, which separated us from our neighbors, sort of dissipates, when this comes down, starts to come down, it's not coming back up.
Russia is intensifying Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces are deliberately targeting civilians in western Ukraine. Other parts of the country are beginning to pick up the pieces, an effort leaders say will cost billions of dollars. Though the war is far from over, some areas are buzzing with the sounds of construction as families return to clean up and revive their war-torn cities. George Thomas brings us the story from Kyiv.
As Russia steps up its offensive in the east, Ukraine's government is moving forward with plans to rebuild battle-damaged areas it still holds.
All of them suffered large-scale destructions, and this also means the need for colossal funds for the restoration of infrastructure, for the return of medicine and social services, and for the restoration of normal economic life.
From hospitals to schools to apartment buildings to churches to shopping malls, the government in Kyiv estimates it will need at least $750 billion to rebuild what the Russians have destroyed.
So we understand that it's huge money, but we understand that some of them will be compensated from confiscated Russian assets.
These cities on the outskirts of Kyiv, once under Russian occupation, are today slowly coming back to life. This is the city of Borodyanka, which is basically probably about 20 minutes north of Bucha. And we've been hearing a lot, obviously, about Bucha. What's really cool is, look at this. I mean, just a few days after the Russians were, well, chased out of this part of the city, north of Kyiv, the cleanup has begun. They want to try to get life back to normal as best as possible. While some swept, others like Oleg Krupnitsky used bigger tools like this John Deere excavator to move debris.
People have to start rebuilding at some point. They need to live somewhere. They are left without homes, without apartments, so people are working. People are trying to live.
In nearby Irpin, Ludmila Voronina is overcome with grief, but knows she has to start somewhere.
This house is already 70 years old. We can't leave it without repairing it.
About 3 hours north, volunteers from across Ukraine have come to Yahini to help the village get back on its feet. Most of the 400 residents here spent a month in the school's basement during the initial Russian attack. Now, volunteers like Kyiv resident Denis Oravchenko are helping villagers rebuild as quickly as possible.
People have grief, and while our soldiers in the east are protecting us, we work here.
As war enters its 5th month, residents from Yahini to Irpin to Bucha are not sitting around waiting for fighting to stop. Ukraine's president says the monumental effort to rebuild his nation is underway, but will take time and a huge commitment from the international community.
It is not only about what we should do after our victory or in the following years, but also what we need to do right now.
And even though fighting still rages in the east, the sounds of construction elsewhere serve as a sign of defiance and hope. George Thomas, CBN News, Kyiv, Ukraine.
Coming up, the Rock of Israel, Jewish and Christian efforts to reunite Ethiopians with their Jewish family in Israel. It's called Soar Israel, the Rock of Israel, an exciting and renewed effort helping thousands of Ethiopians join their Jewish families in Israel. While this fulfills prophecy, unfortunately, others are being left behind indefinitely. CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl takes us to Gondar, Ethiopia, for the story.
When Werke Gemai and her siblings arrived at the airport in Tel Aviv, they greeted their 86-year-old mother, Rebebu Shivesh. They had no idea that it would take them 19 years to join her in Israel.
During the wait, we encountered all kinds of challenges. There were many grandchildren and great-grandchildren born, and she doesn't know them. Also, my nephew was killed in the army last year. It was difficult to tell his grandmother that her grandson was killed when she was there all alone.
Another one of Rebebu Shivesh's grandsons studied in a Jewish seminary in Israel on a student visa and then returned to Ethiopia. He accompanied his family to become a citizen in Israel.
I have a few plans. I want to get a university degree, but we'll see if I manage. It won't be easy because of the language.
Despite the waiting, they looked forward to a Holy Land reunion.
First of all, we feel blessed that we can move to the land of Israel. It's a land that even Moses wasn't allowed to tread on. We're very excited that this is the land God promised to our forefathers, and we are arriving there.
Sadly, this family's story is not unique.
We're here in the synagogue in Gondar, Ethiopia. It's the only synagogue, and all the people you see behind me are waiting for permission to go to Israel. Some have been in the process for as many as 20 years.
There's a privately run feeding program for children under 5 and nursing mothers here, as well as a summer camp.
Those who are staying here live in 2 main neighborhoods. What's important is that everyone here wasn't born in a city. Everyone here is from a village, and they moved here to put in their request to make Aliyah. But they came from the surrounding villages, some kilometers from Gondar. You have to understand, the minute you leave your village, you left your land and you don't have the possibility to return.
Adana Tadela leads the Jewish agency operations in Ethiopia. As a 16-year-old in the 80s, Tadele walked some 300 miles at night across these mountains to Sudan and hid during the day for fear of being arrested. After a year in Sudan, he was flown to Israel.
We opened here in 1992. Close to 85,000 Ethiopians immigrated and were taken care of in this place. What we're doing now is we're going to facilitate Aliyah for 3,000 immigrants.
The Jewish agency partners with Christian organizations like CBN to help resettle the immigrants and the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews that chartered the Aliyah flight to Israel.
I feel the words of the prophets coming to life, that 2,000 years ago, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they saw this. They saw this. There was a united Israel with all of the tribes in Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed and the tribes were dispersed. And these prophets said, don't lose faith, they'll be reunited.
CEO Yael Eckstein says her organization helps bring around 5,000 Jews home each year.
And I think of my grandfather, who's a Holocaust survivor from Germany. Escaping the Nazis, his family in concentration camp in Auschwitz, killed. And he opens up the Bible and says, one day the Jews will go home to Israel. One day the lost tribes will be found. One day Jews from all over the world will be reunited on the shoulders of the Gentiles, that it will be Christians who will make this happen.
According to the Israeli law of return, anyone with a Jewish grandparent who was not converted to another religion is allowed to become a citizen. It's called making Aliyah. Many Ethiopian Jews, however, have had trouble proving their lineage in order to qualify.
Part of them here don't qualify under the law of return. The majority are entering according to the law of entry, according to the decision of the government that has criteria that changes every time. Therefore, each time only a small number can go because the criteria are very restrictive. That doesn't give an answer to all those who are waiting.
That has left people like Leah Kabede waiting for more than 2 decades for seemingly no reason.
When I was 5 years old, my family brought me here to make Aliyah to Israel. My mother waited about 23 years to go to Israel, and she has 7 brothers and sisters, and they all live in Israel now.
Leah had to wait another 1.5 years after that because she's married. But finally, she and her husband were approved and came to Israel on the recent flight, together with their 3 small children and her sister and sister's family, though not everyone is going.
The woman sitting beside me is my father's sister. She's my aunt. Her process is not in progress. She's going to be left behind when we leave.
Why do they continue to wait for so many years?
We are unquestionably Jews, so we want to go to Israel because that is where we belong. We want to go to Israel not only to have a better life, but also to protect the people of Israel and its government.
Up next, who are the Ethiopian Jews and why has it been so difficult for them to come to Israel? Who are the Ethiopian Jews and why has it been so hard for them to come to Israel? Here's Julie Stahl with more on the story of the Ethiopian Aliyah from Gondar and the origins of the community.
The origins of Ethiopian Jewry are unclear, but most believe they are part of the lost biblical tribe of Dan. Adding another dimension, many also trace their lineage to the Queen of Sheba. The Bible says the queen went to visit King Solomon to hear his wisdom. Ethiopians say the queen bore Solomon's son, who led a dynasty lasting thousands of years. Known as Beta Israel, in the 80s, Israel's chief rabbi declared them to be Jews. Later, others who had converted to Christianity under pressure, known as Falashmura, were also included. Since that time, the Israeli government has mounted various operations to bring Ethiopian Jewry and their descendants to Israel, often declaring it as the last round. Balauken Tegenye couldn't go with his parents to Israel because he was already married. Balauken lives in this one room with his wife and 3 daughters.
My grandfather made Aliyah to Israel 11 years ago. My parents and my brother went 2 years ago. My wife is very happy we are going, and she wants to raise our children as Jews.
He adds that since they are already keeping Jewish tradition, adapting to Israel shouldn't be a problem.
When I arrive in Israel, I want to find work, and I want to give a better life to my kids. I can't believe that this day is actually going to happen, and I'm living in a dream now, and I'm afraid to wake up.
And it did happen. He and his 5 siblings went to Israel on the same flight chartered by IFCJ as CBN News, and his last siblings will follow shortly. Nearly 150 new immigrants to Israel boarded that flight in Gondar, transferred in Addis Ababa, and headed home. Werke arrived with a prayer.
Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has brought us to this time.
Dozens of Rebebo Shivesh's relatives were on the plane.
I'm very blessed to meet my children after so many years. It's hard to describe in words. I feel like it's a dream. I'm very, very blessed.
It is really, really tremendously amazing and it's really exciting. So we're all happy. We are going to be reunited with all of our family members.
At the airport, the new immigrants received their paperwork and from there were taken to absorption centers where they'll spend time learning Hebrew and studying Judaism, as well as have time to adjust to life in Israel.
Home is where heart is. So we came home, we're happy. Now everything feels okay and dream come true.
Though it's unclear how many Jews remain in Ethiopia, the Jewish Agency and its Christian supporters stand ready to help fulfill God's word to bring his people back home. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Gondar, Ethiopia, and Tel Aviv.
Still ahead, thousands of Jewish and Israeli athletes compete for gold in Jerusalem. Well, thousands of athletes from across the world are in Israel for the country's biggest sporting event, the Maccabea Games, also called the Jewish Olympics. It's one of the largest sporting events in the world and takes place in Israel every 4 years. It's open to Jewish athletes from every corner of the earth and also Israelis, no matter what their religion. Here they'll compete in sports like swimming, golf, ice hockey, and fencing. President Joe Biden made a special appearance at the Games to cheer on Team USA, the first time ever an American president has attended. Organizers say more than 10,000 athletes from 62 countries will compete for gold at this year's Games. The driving force behind the Games today is to expose Jewish people to Israel. Stephanie from Pittsburgh came to cheer on her two sons.
I think one of the most powerful things that you'll see today is watching the delegations walk in and see that there are Jews in all these different countries around the world and coming together around this sport. And it's just very, very moving and powerful to think about how we're all connected and how this Maccabee Games brings us together.
Well, that's an exciting event here every 4 years in Israel. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.